Well, I can think of several things that I probably wouldn't want to put on a tape, but I'm totally innocent on this one in the fact that I didn't intend to hit Bob. Bob Turnbull lived 2 houses away, and his parents had been divorced. That's the first time I'd run into a single parent situation. And then his mother had married Lenny McCoy, who lived right by the folks. And Bob and I went to school together, and very good friends. And then particular instance, well, everybody had a garden in those days. Everybody raised a lot of their own food and canned it. And that was just kind of basic to the Depression era. But in this case, Bob had been over to Mom and Dad's, and we were out in the driveway there, not very far from the garden. And frost had hit, and there were still tomatoes on the vine, but they weren't in very good condition. And I had an inspiration to see how I could scare Bob, maybe. So I picked a tomato, and he wasn't too far away, and instead of throwing at him, I threw it high as a mortar shell would go. And so I hollered, "Hey, Turnbull," and just as I hollered, that whole thing hit him in the side of the face. And he was one very upset young man and chased me all over DeLong and never did catch me, but he's still a good friend, because 2 years ago, Nell and I were down looking up Nancy, Joe, and Dudley, and I realized when I heard where there's just a street between where Nancy Joe lives and where Bob lives, and he came over, and he got to tell about some of the things that went on at school down there, and for some reason I've forgotten some of them, and then I could remind him of a few things he got in on. Mm-hmm. And then because we were not much for the dating game in high school, he had a Chief motorcycle. The gas control was on the left side instead of the right, and I had a Harley. And I guess while I'm at it, for the benefit of the family, I better tell you about my Harley just a minute. My father, when we first moved to DeLong, there were no gravel roads. They were all dirt roads. And Dad was a mail carrier, and when the frost went out in the spring, he had horses in the barn. He had a couple, 3 Bronco horses, and that's the only way you could get through those roads. They weren't. You drive down a highway today, or one thing or another, you don't think about it, but they were all dirt. Well, one day, my senior year in high school, my dad decided to take the motorcycle to Knoxville. So Sam got on my bike, went to Knoxville, did some errands. By this time, and that'd be 1941, by this time it's gravel at most of the main roads, and then they'd oiled some of those roads. And Dad is coming home from Knoxville, and may have come up a little shower. I don't know what happened. But he came down through what we call Stony Hollow, which is just south of Knoxville, and the bike went out from under him. And Dad come home with some dried blood on his brow and his elbow, and somebody had helped him get the bike up, but he got back to DeLong and come in the house, and he said, "That thing is dangerous." And I had been down a couple of times, although I didn't go home and tell him about it. Mm-hmm. But I made one awfully foolish remark to him, because I said, "You're the one that went down." And he said, "Yeah, and you're the one that's going to get rid of this motorcycle." And so a short time thereafter, I took my motorcycle to Galesburg, Illinois, and I didn't lose any money, but I didn't have a motorcycle. But if Bob had kept that Chief, it would have been worth thousands of dollars today, because they didn't manufacture for about 50 years. And later I got another motorcycle as I got out of the hospital in England in 1945, was signed to the military police, and there were 2 towns north of Southampton, England, where convoys come rolling into southern England to go to the beach, go to the port, be loaded on the ships to France. And so I had a 45 cubic inch Harley Davidson motorcycle. Uncle Sam paid for it, furnished the gas, and that was that's the last of my motorcycle escapades. Whatever.
And what is one of your favorite memories as a preteen?
Well, it was. I don't know when I started carrying papers. I just don't remember. But there was a paper, the Chicago Daily News, and it was about 10 or 12 people in town took the paper. And there was a little accident insurance policy went with it. And I think I made a penny a paper a day. But I know in time I found a decent used bicycle that I bought. And I think we all have to talk about this. If you work and make some spending money, then you get to decide basically how it's going to get spent. Now, if you sit around and wait for your folks to hand it to you, that's a different story. But I had my bike and it was usable, and I thought that was pretty fine until I'm guessing it was my 12th birthday. It'd be 1936, but I came home for dinner, and when I opened the door to the kitchen, why, there was a brand new Sears and Roebuck bicycle sitting in the kitchen, and that's the first new possession that I had, and I thought it was very special, and I was very thrilled to have it.
And then a favorite or a family event during your childhood that sticks out in your memory?
Well, I really, I think I can remember pretty well going to Kansas in the early 30s, and the Dust Bowl was on. It was a very unusual situation, but at one point, probably about 10, we got up maybe 4 o'clock in the morning and had breakfast, and I think some sandwiches and other was prepared, and we started out for St. Francis, Kansas, 750 miles, and I'm almost sure during that day somewhere we stopped and had, each one of us had a nickel ice cream cone. Now, we made a lot of homemade ice cream. We had our own cow, we had our own chickens, we had our own fruit trees, we had our own strawberries, raspberries, and so forth. But to take perfectly good money and buy it for ice cream was part of the trip. And once we'd gotten out to Kansas, I can remember Uncle Hall, who was a real genuine cowboy. And then Mom had an aunt in Denver, Aunt May, I think, or Aunt May Walker. And so that meant we were leaving the flat country of Kansas, and hours later on that stunt, you could begin to, it looked like there was some low clouds, but if you kept looking, it was the Rocky Mountains, and there's no way out here in this flat Midwestern country somebody can explain to you. And then once we got to Denver and Aunt May and down to a block or two, produce brought in there of every kind you could think of. I think it was Long Mountain where Buffalo Bill was buried. And my dad, I didn't have a pocket watch, but Dad bought me a Buffalo Bill watch fob. And it got lost somewhere in the next 50 years or 70. But at that time, that was a very special memory.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds like it. And then, in particular, do you have a picture or object that holds particular memories of my Grandpa Klein, Sam, your dad, and then the same for Grandma, if you have items that particularly catch your attention?
Well, I have the first picture is Mom and Dad when they were married. And that was the 14th of August, 14th of February, for heaven's sakes, 1923. That's a pretty bad mistake. And then I found a picture. It's one of my favorite baby pictures, but about 11 and a half months later, this bald-headed, fat little kid showed up, and probably, I'm guessing he's somewhere from 6 months to a year old here. But one good thing about it, he's got 2 front teeth showing. So that's a dandy. And I don't know, this is Mom and Dad's, this is Mom's parents. And I think the thing that makes this especially meaningful, they both died when I was 6 years old. And I can remember going over to the house in Abingdon and being out in the yard with my cousins. And some of us are a little puzzled about what in the world is the big problem.
Mm-hmm.
Then a few years later, I got to go with Dad, and he had a thrashing machine, and he powered that thrashing machine with an 1836 Hart-Parr tractor, and it had a hand clutch.
Huh.
And the big thing about the thrashing situation was, if I went with the crew, I could save Dad $1 a day from hiring somebody to sit on that tractor. And in a thrashing deal, the first crew to eat is the people that run the tractor and the one that runs the thrashing machine, and the 2 men who have bundles on a rack, and the people that are going to go back out to the field first, and the guy that has an empty wagon to catch oats. But there was 3 or 4 different tables of people fed. I mean, neighbors came. I mean, they all worked together in those days, and each farm wife tried to outdo the other one. And my wages was what I ate at noon. I was hungry, and I got my money's worth. And then now, or I don't know about now or a little later, this is a picture of my little brother showing up, but I don't know what sequence you want that.
No, that's fine.
But this is a picture in the fall of 1941. I'm on the football team and the yearbook program, and I'm secretary of the 4-H Federation, and I'm active in FFA and some other stuff. And I'm having breakfast in DeLong, and Mom says, "I think you're the only person in this town that doesn't know what's going on." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Have you noticed that I was putting on weight?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, what did you think that was?" And I said, "Well, I'd heard people talk about the middle-age spread." And she said, "Well, we're expecting an addition to the family." And so here's Sam, very proud brother, and still a very proud brother. And then later in the game, after, let's see, this would have been after I'd gotten home from service, I went down to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I don't think Nancy Jo remembers me coming by to visit, although she did sit on my lap and decide to give me a new form of baptism. But it was a wonderful experience to be able to go down and see the first new grandchild.
Mm-hmm. Yep. How about any special memories that you have, particular things of Grandma and Grandpa, your folks?
Well, Dad was the only one in his family that finished high school. And Dad played a little football. I don't think he ever claimed to be much of a star. I don't know if he played any basketball, but his junior year, he went down to the sectional track meet, and of course, if he wins in the mile run, why he can run in the state. And so somewhere in the race, I don't know when, but a kid spiked him. And Sam went down in a cloud of cinders, and it almost cut that Achilles tendon. And he was hospitalized for a while in Macomb, and then later, of course, got back up to the Abingdon area and got some crutches and used these crutches, and then walking, and then he's about 4 miles southwest of town in school, so I'm sure as soon as he was able to jog, he would do that. And he went back to the sectional track meet the next year, his senior year. And just before the race, one of the runners said to him, "I hope what happened last year doesn't happen again. I spiked a guy." And Sam didn't know whether he was playing with his head or not, but Sam ran the race, won the race, and went around and said, "And I'm the guy you spiked."
Wow.
So Dad was a pretty tough monkey. And Mom, when she finished high school, she went down to Western and took some short courses down there. And the fall after she got out of high school, she's teaching at the Oak Grove grade school, 8 grades, a bunch of kids, and she's teaching about 5 miles northeast of Abingdon, and her parents live about 5 miles west of Abingdon, maybe 6 miles. So she rides her horse over to the Ryden, R-Y-D-E, and the family who she's staying with, their name is Ryden, and she boards her horse all week at Ryden's, and then Friday she rides back to her family. And so she had some experience teaching school as an 18-year-old high school graduate. And then the next year she was hired to teach at Cross Lanes, which is west of Abingdon. So it's about 8 miles less riding back and forth. So she taught 1922 at Cashman out here west of town, or Cross Lanes out here west of town. And I think that was her school teaching career. And so both my parents, at that time, a lot of people had to go home and go to work. Some people didn't care, but they at least got a high school diploma. Dad went to Heading College 1 year, and then of course in 1923 they got married. And the main thing that he'd ever done was grow up on a farm, and so that's when they started farming south of DeLong.
What would you say, are there some, I guess what did I put here? 3 major tips that you think that your folks provided to you over their lifetime?
The first one that comes to me loud and clear, Dad would have lost the farm. 7 out of 10 farmers lost their farm in the late 20s, the early 30s. And so Dad took this exam for a rural mail carrier. There's another individual, I'll leave his name out of it, although some of the family knows it, most of us know his name. There was another man taking that test that day whose uncle was postmaster in Galesburg. And if this individual had written a passing grade, he would have been the carrier, but he didn't. He didn't write a good enough test. And so Dad was able to have a steady income so that he could pay on the mortgage and one thing and another and hang on to the farm. And he taught me from the time I was very young, you have an obligation to serve the public. Your job is to serve the public. And he meant that in a very big sense. With 3 younger sisters, it was just very evident to me from time to time, you can't sort cattle or you can't do this or that or open gates or whatever if by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so at an early age and for many years to come, Dad and I worked together. I just as well be very brutally frank. At times he was a little bit impatient, and I think I probably got caught with some of the same characteristics. But Dad and I did a lot of work together. I raised, got a lot of, my senior year in high school I had 8 sows, and I was producing at that time about 100 head of hogs a year, and there were certain needs of dealing with these animals, and I did, there was a process that's used on the males that is necessary, and you just learn to do a lot of things because it's your own. I had never driven a team of horses to plant corn, and there was a little piece of ground east of grandmother's house, so I plowed it and disked it and worked it down, and I borrowed Harry Kramer's team of horses and a corn planter. And you got a marker as you go across the field, and if you do a real good job of driving, you'd have a straight row. And when I could see where that marker was, it was obvious to me that they weren't going to be quite as straight as I wished. And when the corn came up, they weren't straight. And the dear old ag teacher, Mr. Brokaw, came out to look at my corn. I was kind of ashamed about it, and he kind of smiled, and he said, "Well, Fred, I've got good news." He said, "You can raise more corn in a crooked road than you can a straight road." So he even had an excuse to get me off the hook. And this man was a role model big time, because I don't think there's any person that had any more reason for me to want to be an ag teacher than Mr. Brokaw. He was a very unusually fine instructor.
What was it about him that caught your attention?
He was a disciplinarian. He treated everybody fairly. He meant business. And many years later, when I started the ag department at Kewaunee, Illinois, he was over at Geneseo, and we were in the same district competing with each other in judging contests and many other things. And one night I'll never forget being in a restaurant in Cambridge, Illinois, county seat, and I was sitting with a kid who was just coming on board as a new ag teacher, and I'd had a rough day that day in Kewaunee with 160-some kids in the study hall, the last period of the day, and I'm sitting talking to my fellow teacher in Cambridge, and all of a sudden Brokaw says, "Hold it," and the rest of the teachers quit talking at the table. "What's the deal?" And he said, "You see that guy down there?" He said, he's responsible for some of my gray hair, and you ought to hear him complaining now about those kids in Kewaunee." So whatever goes around comes around.
Yes.
But I dealt with him many years later,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a privilege.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Other tips that you might have gotten, or other lessons learned from your folks?
Certainly you're responsible for what you do. It isn't your background, it isn't your parents, it isn't your heredity, it isn't your society. You are responsible for what you do. And Mom had a butter paddle, and if the butter paddle came out of the drawer and there wasn't any butter around, you're in a whole lot of trouble. But there was a very disciplined situation, and if I did some things, I got in trouble in one instance going to a football game with my senior year. But as long as Eleanor's riding in the car, I haven't got a prayer. But the principal got up one morning and studied in the gym and forbid anybody to go to the game this afternoon between Roseville and Knoxville. We played them both. And Lyle Dunlap and I were a couple of country kids, and we had a sandwich and an apple or whatever, and boy, isn't that going to be a heck of a ball game. I said, "Let's go." So we went. And of course Eleanor beat me in the house when I got home, so I was a dead duck from the beginning. And Monday morning when I went to school, I didn't have an excuse from my parents for being absent Friday afternoon. And the principal was waiting for me out in the hall. And he invited me into his office and he said, "Where were you Friday afternoon?" And I had looked for Lyle Dunlap's car when I got to school and I didn't see it. And I said, "Well, Mr. Benner, I got some Hampshire hogs out in DeLong and they're hard to confine, and so I was building fence out in DeLong." He said, "Well, Fred, I got one problem. Lyle Dunlap's already been here, and he said he went to the game with you. It was your idea. And I went to the game and I saw you there." So my career in crime didn't go very far. Gosh, can't believe it. Yeah.
Well, actually, part of the reason I'd asked you about the ag teacher was you mentioned that he was a bit of a mentor.
Oh.
Were there any others that you had that
As
come
it
to
turned
mind?
out, there was a kid that was older, several years older, and I came in out of 8 grades in DeLong into Abingdon. I don't think I knew 10 kids in Abingdon school, and I couldn't imagine having been in one room for every class all day long in DeLong, that you had to go from one class to another. That was really bothering me. But you soon get acquainted and you soon make the best of it. But coming over to high school was a big change. And I will say one thing: the day I got to Abingdon High School, I knew I was a country kid, and the day I graduated, I still knew I was. Every school has a clique. You're either in it or you're not. And I'll confess, and I'll do it right now. There was a tradition at Abingdon High School that if anybody won in either oratory or musical in the military track and events in Knox College, if you won first, you had the obligation of doing it the night you graduate. And I don't mind telling you that this dumb farm kid from DeLong had won the competition in the military track meet in serious declamation, and I did the Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe my senior year, and it gave me a lot of pride because some of these hot shots in the clique didn't perform.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I was the only one on the program that night. But I shouldn't make so much out of it, but it's just something that once it happened, when you look back at it, it made you feel pretty good at the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And I had on a long gown so they couldn't see my knees shaking. I was scared silly.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
What event has most shaped your life?
Well, there isn't one. There's 2.
Okay. What 2 events?
Okay. Well, I got that ahead of time, and
Yep.
I've sat and puzzled about it. I'm so fortunate, and we're all so fortunate to be born into a 2-parent home. A family that goes to Sunday school and church. When I walked in that building in DeLong, and when I walked in that church and looked up on the stage, Dad was either the superintendent or Mom was, or she was playing the piano or he was, and they were a key part of that church all of their life, and they just they had a wonderful man. John Maine was the minister of the Congregational Church in Abingdon, and he came out and covered the church at DeLong. And so it probably, I ought to know the exact date, but I don't, somewhere about 12 or 13, why I just felt the need at the end of a service with a man that was a good friend of my parents, a man I really respected, and I got up out of wherever I was there in the church and went forward and made the confession, and I consider that a very key part in my life, and it's something we all should do and probably renew once in a while. Mm-hmm. But in the next breath, many years later, On the 16th of November, 1944, I'd been up in the front lines almost 6 weeks. My right foot was twice its regular size and black as the ace of spades. I couldn't keep my boot on. I had to get an overshoe off of a dead soldier. And I came out of the front lines in combat alive. And material things or money, those values will never mean as much to me as just being alive, having your faith, and you doggone near lost your faith, because there really is no other word for it. There used to be an argument between the fundamentalists and the liberal people in church. The liberal people says there ain't no hell, and the fundamentalist says the hell there ain't. And I lived in hell a few weeks. And in a sense, you've almost got to work your way back again to some of those ideas, because for a period in your life, I can't think of anything that has affected me as much as that. And I'm not unique in that whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how that one works.
Sure. Another question here is 3 major tips you would give others about living a significant life.
Well, certainly, I was in a men's group just a few days ago in Minnesota, and we were sitting there trying to decide, a bunch of people from 70 on up to 90, if this is a Christian nation, and we think it still is. But I just can't imagine living a life and not having some basic religious convictions. A Savior sacrificed himself for us all, and when you look around at all the good people, really good people you've known in your life, most of those people have a Christian background. If they're a genuinely honest, God-fearing Christian, their lives are a wonderful example to everybody who knows them about what true faith is. And so it's very basic. And certainly it's kind of a repeat on some of the things that I was told as a kid. I was down in Fort Myers not too long ago. Thomas Edison spent most of his life in Fort Myers, next door to Henry Ford, next door to Harvey Firestone. And when I think of those 3 men, and really Edison, hundreds of patents, very little formal education, almost would have been homebound. I mean, his mother must have been a genius. But Edison said, the harder I work, the luckier I become. And that about 1% was inspiration and 99% is perspiration. And I'll never forget my coach in high school out there in football, and I had a chance to tell him about it about a year before he died. But Coke Mills told us loud and clear along about 1940 and 41, you're out there in the dirt and the grass or mud. In the fall of 41, we played 8 mud games. And nobody gets hurt as bad in the mud because you can't get good footing. But he said, fellas, it isn't a question of how dirty you get. It's a question of how long you stay dirty. Now, I've worked around a farm. I've done a lot of dirty work. Maybe it's demeaning. Maybe you should just work in an air-conditioned office in a business suit and not get down in the trenches. But I've worked outside. I've done a lot of hard, dirty work. But however dirty you get, it isn't a question how dirty you are. It's a question of how long you stay dirty. And that's not only a physical thing. I listened to a sermon Sunday morning. It just isn't our outer exterior dirt. It's what comes out of your mouth and what comes out of your head and your heart. And so there's so many poems, and there's so many different reminders of. Nell finally caught up with me. I used to tell her, and before I met Nell, I heard this a long time ago. Life has loveliness to sell. Buy it and never count the cost. For a few bright shining hours of peace, count many a year of strife well lost. And she kept telling me where I'd read that, and I really didn't remember. I said, well, I didn't read it, I wrote it. And on my birthday card, last February 1st, she'd gone on the net and found out the author. And then another one that Dad used to do some different poetry from up in the days in Alaska and one thing or another, but I always liked the one, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. Departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Footprints which perhaps another struggling o'er life's sodden main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother seeing will take heart again. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate. Keep on learning, keep pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. So that's just, if there's something you've learned, it's something that will make you, remind you of what you should be doing, why. But Dad was very good about poetry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Let's see. Any other things that you wanted to mention about growing up in DeLong, about Grandma and Grandpa that I haven't already asked you about here?
Well, if we really look at the past, and that's what I'm doing, all of our ancestors, in our case, came from Europe, and they happened to be white, and most of them were Protestants. But when you think of the heritage that we have accepted, when you think of individuals in various countries in Europe, whether it be Scotland, Ireland, England, Germany, or France, and we have it in our genealogy, those 5 countries in particular, and there's probably some others. But when you really look at what those people did, and not only did they come to this country, but then people came from the East Coast to the Midwest, and when you look at, we can trace Dad back to Ohio, that's as far as we can get with him. We can trace the Walkers all the way back to Scotland in the 1700s, and but we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, and there was again a big religious emphasis. Many of them came here for religious freedom, and it's been a real thrill to go back to Scotland and some other places and try to catch a little bit of the flavor of but today in a society of almost 50% divorce, and when we came home from school at night, our mother was there. They didn't come home to an empty home. And I look around, and I'm associated with different people, a lot of people in a single-parent home, and I just have so much to be grateful for. My parents didn't come to this country. My grandparents didn't come to this country, but we know the succession of those who did. And I think Mom and Dad were both above average students, and I think they had good values about, well, not too long after Mom's death, and Dad had preceded her, and about another 3 or 4 very key people in the DeLong area, and the church is gone. And one of the saddest days of my life was the day I went to that auction. And people walking around in there with manure on their boots and smoking, and profanity, and I said over and over, God forgive them. They know not what they do. But I didn't ask to have these parents, but they were wonderful. And you live in this little community where everybody knows each other. Maybe they know more about you than you realize, but they care about you. And I don't know who it is, but somebody says it takes a community to raise a child, and I think that's the kind of a community I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why I was so lucky, but I'll take it.
Yep.
and try to remember how special it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Too true. Well, a couple other questions. Are you still up for continuing?
Yeah. Right.
In particular, wondering about one of the first pictures or objects or anything that hold fond memories about Marilyn Long, Marilyn Klein, or Marilyn Long, either one.
Well, one of the interesting things about, in this case, my little sister, by the time I got home from service, when Marilyn was obviously, like all the rest of the family, a little older, and she finished high school, and she did quite well. And so I hear some conversation about nurses training. And so I've been to Europe and the South Pacific, and I can just give her all kinds of good advice that she didn't even ask for. And I guess if I had broken the tie, I would have had Marilyn go to college a year or two before she took on the reality of nurses training, and maybe you're in the room with some very ill patient, and half an hour later they're dead. And there's a lot of reality to deal with. But I think that I tried very inadequately to get her to just be a little older before she went into nurses training. And I'll never forget the night she graduated, because she wasn't flippant about it. She was just quietly stating a fact. I made it, and I was so proud of her. I didn't know how to act. But in that case, my counseling was supplanted by the one that was doing it. Mm-hmm. And so I particularly, I was so proud of her that I didn't know how to act. And we certainly have evidence many years later when she's picked as Woman of the Year in Bowling Green for some of her accomplishments, that she deserved all the credit she had then and now. But I always, I was an only child until I had a sister. And then along came another sister, and by the time Marilyn got along, I came along, why it was kind of a good idea to just keep adding sisters. And it's no question, I presume it's somewhat normal that the sibling next to me would be the one that I would confront the most and have various differences of opinion. But by the time Marilyn was in the game, well, she was kind of my little cheerleader, and very positive, very happy young lady. And I've already told her, and I would tell her again, that she exemplifies to me in many ways. She reminds me in many ways of my mother, in her interest in flowers and garden and church and neighboring, and I see such a parallel in her values and her philosophy, and that's just the way it is. That I'm not saying that any one of us were ahead or behind the other one, but she certainly is reminds me a lot of Mom. That's just the way it is.
Yeah. You remember the first time or an early time that you met my dad?
Yeah, and it was Marilyn had dated another guy or two, and when Cliff come along, looks like to me he's heads and shoulders ahead of these other guys because he's highly disciplined. He's come out of a situation up in the big city. He's advanced himself educationally, and as it turned out, they had an interest in music, and they obviously, by the time I saw Cliff, it was pretty well established that they were in love with each other, and if he can make my sister happy, that makes me happy. But he had some high goals, his doctor's degree. He had some musical talents that meshed very well, and there's no question in my mind that Marilyn and Cliff made a good model for the rest of the family. And I think the fact, I think I'll just say this because I mean it. I think one of the reasons that your family is so able to deal with each other and care for each other and stick together has a lot to do with the model of your parents. And I wish that everybody could have been that lucky. And it isn't luck. You guys took trips and, I mean, you spent a lot of quality time together. And after all, Cliff was the first PhD in that family.
Right.
And I still get a kick out of walking another Dr. Long out in the yard and taking a picture of him just to keep him on his toes. But and then we have to begin to ask ourselves, everybody, while it worked for Cliff and Marilyn went ahead and got her degree, there's a lot of very fine, successful people who didn't go on to college. I mean, I think at times we have to be careful. For instance, when the last time we were out at Sacramento with Nell's sister, she didn't happen to go on to college. Nell's brother went to Purdue, got a degree. Nell went on after she'd had 7 children. After the youngest 2 were first grade, Roger said, "No, you're going back to school and finish your training." Well, he died at 56, and she could put her kids through college because she had that training. But at times I'll never forget going to a high honors banquet with one of my kids, and the speaker looked around this crowded basement of a church and a whole bunch of parents and students, high honors, and he said, "I want to tell you something, folks. When you get out here in life, in the real world, and you find yourself with somebody with a whole lot of personality and they're your boss, and they didn't get straight A's, but there's an awful lot of very successful people out here who didn't necessarily hit the top of the cycle on the grades they earned." And I thought, you better listen to that one. That was one to listen to. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Let's see, any defining moments in your relationship with Mom, especially like an early defining moment? You talked a little bit about the graduation.
She was my little sister, but the moment, the proof of the pudding was the night she graduated. That definitely was. I mean, well, she isn't my little sister, but she's the youngest sister and always will be. But I'd have given anything to have been in Bowling Green the night that she was honored. And your dad, that was so well done that we really need to take part in the Chamber of Commerce. We're really out here in this segregated college atmosphere. We need to be, and I guess you kids were there maybe, or some of you, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember that particular event.
I don't know for sure. But,
yeah.
But ooh, and I asked her then, what did she say? And she said she didn't remember, and I don't see how she would have.
So Dad got her there at sort of in a ruse that they needed to get some more involvement in the community.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. Oh gosh, that's excellent.
Yep.
Yeah, but no, she was a very happy child. I just can't think of her. There was a period after Sam showed up. She'd been the only child for several years, and there was a time that that she and my brother would get into it pretty good. And I'm pretty well off the scene here, but I mean, I might listen and choose to ignore it, but when the chips were really down, and as a nurse, when Dad died, she's the one that reached over and closed his eyelids. I mean, even at one of the most stressful moments in their entire life, she's doing what she was trained to do. But I wrote her a birthday card a good many years ago, and I was trying to think of the ultimate compliment in her case, and it's what I just said a while ago. She's more like Mom, and this isn't putting down the other two sisters.
Right.
Nope.
And I guess another question here, recommendations about what has worked for you in living a more faith-based life.
Well, I've taught a Sunday school class for something over 40 years, and I've been in a choir, and these are things that you do in public, and elder, deacon, and these sorts of other responsibilities, chairman of the board, and so forth. But certainly, okay, it's happened to me several times. I might be someplace without any warning. Somebody said, would you open with a prayer, or would you close with a prayer? Mm-hmm. Well, the simple facts are, and I'm not a saint by any stretch of the imagination, we should be mindful all the time of how fortunate we are, how important God is, how important His Son is, and the Holy Spirit. But it shouldn't be that you shouldn't be told 3 days before the meeting to sit down and write a prayer. I mean, but a number, it's just, now then I'm doing it for the family in Minneapolis, Christmas time, or other times. I'm up there, so I now have the same role with a different family. And that's really neat. We all grab hands and time or two, Nelson, keep it short.
People are hungry.
Yeah. But, and we have our prayer in the evening at the meal. And, but I think more than what you might see in a structured setup, I think it's something that you should be carrying with yourself all the time. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I was the first grandchild of the Klein tribe, and I was named for my grandpa Fred Eli Klein. And if you go back in the Bible and you find out about Eli, when Fred's parents named him Fred Eli, there was a reason. They understood their Bible and they gave him that name. And there's been a time or two that I was told, and rightfully so, that I was Flora Klein's favorite grandchild. Well, she was 35 years old and he was killed. He was in his 40s, she's 35 years old when Fred Klein is killed. And years later, a little boy is named for that man. Plus the fact, she's in DeLong where I have livestock, and I would see her every day of the year. And oftentimes as I was coming up and doing my chores, there would be a glass of what I would call V8 juice sitting there on the table. And I'd run in and see my grandmother. So I didn't ask to be the first child. I didn't ask to be named for my grandfather, but I'm very happy that I was. Mm-hmm. And then Mom took care of the Walker part, so we now have me and Rick and Eric. And when we thought our third pregnancy, we didn't have ultrasound. We just assumed we were going to have another girl. We had clothes, we had toys, and that would have been okay, but I kind of checked Rick out and decided that wasn't going to be appropriate. But when I had a phone call when Eric was born and was told that there was another Frederick W. Klein, I had some tears, and if it happened again, I'd have them again, because it isn't the end of the world. And Uncle Claire made his family pretty unhappy because he didn't have any male heirs. Claire, Dad's mom's brother. But by golly, when Louise had polio, I have not, the only other time I've been that afraid was combat itself. But people were dying from polio, people were being terribly crippled, and I would say from the period that I found out she had the polio until the baby was born was one of the most intense periods of my life. And God was very good to all of us. And not only did this polio scare the whole country because nobody knew how to stop it, but it turned out years later older women got it back again. And I dealt with a salesman who was a little older than I was, and so several years ago, Louise had polio in her 20s, and many years later, a good friend in Monmouth, polio came back on his wife, and he had to put her in a nursing home. So not only did you have it to deal with before Cheryl was born, but then there's a little cloud hanging over your life on the chance that it would come back. And of course, the minute they got the vaccine, why everybody, I mean, we don't think anything about it, but at that time, it was a crisis in our life. Definitely.
Yeah.
And but I've been afraid. I'm somewhat emotional to begin with, but by golly, I'll tell you, when she ran a temperature for a few days, and I was afraid of brain damage, absolutely, and oh, they did a spinal tap that night. It's polio, that's for sure. The next morning when I get to the hospital, they asked me to come in the office. They want to know if I have insurance. It turned out Louise's mother had bought a policy for both families. And so Helen Harshbarger can be thanked for polio treatment. It didn't cost us a penny. And but the next morning, I'm going into an isolation ward with a white gown and a face mask. And as I'm going to that isolation area, I can hear an iron lung. And that son of a buck was in the room next to Louise. And that was just another level of, and so
Anything I haven't asked you about? Obviously, tomorrow we're going to talk some
we'll do
some war items as
Yeah.
well as some more visiting around some other areas.
Right.
Good, good. All right. Thanks, Fred.
Well, it's way too long. You cut the heck. I already told about the date, 16th of November. There's some stretchers laying here by an ambulance, and we're going to be loaded up and out of there, and a shell hit not too far away, and some shrapnel rattled up against the ambulance. Well, they got us in the ambulance, and they went to what would be kind of probably a little schoolhouse. It was an aid station. And there, in a rather short period of time, is a mess kit full of hot food. Hot food. Now you can lay $100 bill right over here in the mess cut of hot food, and you can have your $100 bill. I have no place to shop. I can't get off this stretcher, but I am going to really relish that food. And after a bit, they're going to come with an old green olive drab blanket, and you're going to put that over you from your old feet all the way up to your chin, and you're going to lay under that blanket. I was under a roof one night in 6 weeks. I was in a stinking hole in the ground. And so lay down another $100. I'll take the hot meal and I'll take the blanket. You can have the money. So a lot of whatever I was or will be goes back to that.
Yeah.